powerful billionaire was in the middle of a serious meeting when suddenly a little girl burst into the room crying. "My mom is in trouble." Everyone thought she was just a scared child. But minutes later, the shocking truth about who she really was left the entire room completely speechless. Stay tuned because you are about to watch a beautiful story and find out what happened next. Hello family, welcome to Tales by King. Kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more beautiful stories. Thank you as you do so. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. The meeting room on the 35th floor of Richmond Global Towers was one of the most important rooms in the entire building. The walls were made of glass, showing a beautiful view of the city skyline. Expensive chairs surrounded a long polished table. A giant screen displayed graphs, numbers, and business projections. Around the table sat powerful investors, lawyers, and senior executives. No one was smiling. The discussion was serious. At the head of the table sat Richard Richmond, the billionaire CEO of Richmond Global. At just 38 years old, Richard had built a powerful company that owned hotels, real estate, and technology firms across the country. People feared his meetings. Richard was calm, intelligent, and very strict. When he spoke, everyone listened. One of the directors stood beside the screen, giving a presentation. "If we approve this investment," the man explained, pointing to the chart, "the company could expand into 3 new international markets by next year." Several board members nodded. Another investor leaned forward. "But the risk is extremely high." Richard remained silent, listening carefully. He folded his hands on the table as he studied the numbers. The room was so quiet that even the sound of someone turning a page felt loud. Then suddenly, bang! The large conference room door burst open violently. The noise echoed through the entire room. Everyone turned in shock. Standing at the doorway was a small girl, no more than 7 years old. Her hair was slightly messy, her clothes were simple, and her breathing was heavy as if she had been running through the building. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the room exploded into confusion. How did she get up here? Where is security? What is happening? 2 security guards quickly rushed toward the door. "Little girl, you can't be here," one of them said. But the girl ignored them. She ran straight into the room. "My mom is in trouble," she cried loudly. Her small voice filled the huge boardroom. The entire meeting stopped. The executives looked stunned. This had never happened before. The girl looked around the room nervously, searching for someone. Her eyes finally stopped on Richard. Maybe it was the way everyone else seemed to respect him. Maybe it was because he was sitting at the center of the room. Slowly, she walked toward him. "My mom didn't do anything," she said through her tears. Security reached her and gently tried to guide her away. "Come with us," the guard said. But before they could move her, Richard raised his hand. "Stop." His voice was calm, but it carried authority. The guards froze immediately. The entire room became quiet again. Richard slowly stood up from his chair. Everyone watched him. No one expected what he would do next. Richard walked toward the crying girl. When he reached her, he knelt slightly so his eyes were level with hers. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Mara," she sniffed. "Mara," Richard repeated gently. "Why are you crying?" "They say my mommy stole something," Mara said as her voice trembled. "She didn't steal anything. They are shouting at her." Some of the executives exchanged confused looks. Richard glanced toward his assistant, standing near the wall. "Find out what is happening downstairs," he said quietly. But before she could move, Mara suddenly grabbed Richard's hand tightly. Her small fingers wrapped around his. "Please come," she begged. "They won't listen to me." The room became completely silent. A billionaire CEO being pulled by a small child in the middle of a billion-dollar meeting. It was something none of them had ever imagined. Richard looked down at the frightened little girl. Her eyes were filled with fear and desperation. For a moment, Richard remembered something from long ago. A memory of someone asking him for help when he was younger. Then he made a decision. Richard gently squeezed Mara's hand. "All right," he said calmly. He turned to the board members. Meeting paused. The directors looked shocked. But sir, the investors are waiting. They can wait. Richard began walking toward the door, still holding Mara's hand. The powerful executives sitting around the table stared in disbelief. No one spoke. No one stopped him. Because in that moment, the most important man in the building had just walked away from $1 million meeting to help a crying little girl. And none of them knew yet that this small interruption was about to change 3 lives forever. Richard walked quickly down the hallway with Mara still holding his hand tightly. The little girl's fingers were trembling. Behind them, several executives and assistants quietly followed. They were curious and confused. It was the first time anyone had seen the powerful CEO leave an important meeting like this. As they turned the corner of the hallway, raised voices could be heard. "I'm telling you I didn't take it." The voice sounded desperate. Richard slowed down. Mara suddenly squeezed his hand harder. "That's my mommy," she whispered. At the end of the hallway, 2 security officers stood beside a woman wearing a blue cleaner's uniform. Her name was Emily. Her shoulders were tense, and her eyes were red from crying. She looked exhausted and frightened. Standing in front of her was a supervisor from the guest services department. His face was serious and impatient. "The bracelet disappeared from the executive suite after you cleaned the room," the supervisor said firmly. "You were the last person inside." Emily shook her head quickly. "I swear I didn't take anything." The supervisor crossed his arms. "It was a very expensive diamond bracelet. The guest is demanding an explanation." Emily's voice began to shake. "I've worked here for 3 years. I have never stolen anything." One of the security officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we will have to escort you to the security office while we investigate." Before anyone could move, "Mommy." Mara ran toward her. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Mara." The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother tightly. "They are saying bad things about you," Mara cried. Emily immediately knelt down and hugged her daughter. "Sweetheart, why are you here? You're supposed to be in school." "I came because they said you were in trouble," Mara said. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back tears. Then a quiet voice spoke behind them. "What seems to be the problem here?" Everyone turned. Standing there was Richard Richmond, the billionaire CEO. The supervisor immediately straightened. "Mr. Richmond, we didn't realize you were." Richard looked around calmly. "What is happening?" The supervisor cleared his throat. "There has been a theft, sir. A guest reported a missing diamond bracelet from the executive suite." Richard nodded slightly. "And you believe she took it?" The supervisor gestured toward Emily. She was the last person inside the room. Emily slowly stood up, still holding Mara's hand. "Sir, I didn't steal anything," she said quietly. Richard looked at her carefully. Her face showed fear, but also something else. Honesty. Then Richard looked at Mara. The little girl was staring at him with hopeful eyes. "My mommy is a good person," she said softly. The hallway became quiet. Richard turned to the security officers. "Did anyone search the room again?" The supervisor answered quickly. "Yes, sir. We already checked." Richard shook his head slightly. "Check again." The supervisor hesitated. "But sir, we already." Richard looked at him calmly. "Check again." His voice was not loud, but it carried authority. The security officers nodded immediately and hurried down the hallway toward the executive suite. Everyone waited. The silence felt heavy. Emily stood quietly beside her daughter. Mara held her hand tightly, refusing to let go. Several minutes passed. Then suddenly, a security guard came running down the hallway. "Sir." Everyone turned toward him. "We found the bracelet." The supervisor stepped forward quickly. "Where was it?" The guard looked embarrassed. "It was inside the guest's handbag." The hallway fell completely silent. The supervisor blinked in shock. Emily slowly covered her mouth. Mara looked up proudly. "My mommy told the truth," she said softly. Richard looked at the supervisor. His expression remained calm, but the disappointment in his eyes was clear. "You almost ruined an innocent person's reputation," he said quietly. The supervisor lowered his head. I'm sorry, sir. Richard turned toward Emily. I apologize for what happened today. Emily quickly shook her head. No, sir, it's okay. But Richard knew it wasn't okay. Then he looked at Mara again. The little girl was still holding her mother's hand. Brave, protective, loyal. Richard felt something strange in his chest. Something he could not explain yet. Then he said something that surprised everyone. Emily, I would like to speak with you in my office. Emily blinked in confusion. Sir. Richard nodded calmly. Yes. He looked at Mara and smiled gently. And you can come too. The executives watching from behind exchanged puzzled looks. None of them understood why their powerful CEO was suddenly interested in a cleaner and her daughter. But Richard had already started walking back toward the elevators. And somehow, deep inside his mind, a strange feeling was beginning to grow. A feeling that this moment was more important than anyone realized. Richard's office was quiet. It sat on the highest floor of the building, with tall glass windows that showed the entire city below. From up there, the cars looked tiny and the people looked like moving dots. But inside the office, the atmosphere felt calm. Richard stood beside his desk while Emily sat nervously in one of the chairs across from him. Beside her sat Mara, swinging her small legs gently while looking around the large room with curiosity. She had never been inside such a big office before. There were paintings on the walls, shelves filled with books, and a giant desk made of dark polished wood. Wow, Mara whispered quietly. Your office is bigger than my classroom. Richard couldn't help smiling a little. He sat down slowly behind his desk. Would you like some juice? He asked her. Mara's eyes lit up. Yes. Emily looked embarrassed. You don't have to trouble yourself, sir. It's no trouble, Richard replied calmly. He pressed a small button on his desk. Moments later his assistant entered. Yes, sir? Please bring some juice and snacks. The assistant nodded and left. Emily sat quietly, unsure why the billionaire CEO wanted to speak with her. Richard folded his hands on the desk. How long have you worked here, Emily? He asked. 3 years, she answered softly. And before that, I worked in a small accounting office for a short time. Richard raised his eyebrows slightly. You studied accounting? Yes, sir. What happened? Emily looked down at her hands. My father became very sick. I had to leave school and start working. Richard nodded slowly. Life had not been easy for her. Then he looked toward Mara. The little girl was now standing near the window, staring at the city with wide eyes. It looks like toy cars, she said. Richard chuckled quietly. Yes, it does. He stood up and walked toward the window. Mara looked up at him curiously. Are you the boss of everything here? She asked. Richard smiled. Something like that. Mara studied his face carefully. Children often looked at people longer than adults did. But this time, her expression changed. She tilted her head slightly. Then she said something unexpected. You look like my daddy. The room became very quiet. Emily's head quickly lifted. Mara, she said sharply. The little girl looked confused. What? He does. Emily forced a nervous smile. Sweetheart, that's not polite. But Richard didn't speak. Because something strange had just happened inside his mind. Those words had touched a memory. A very old memory. He looked down at Mara again. The shape of her eyes. The way she tilted her head when she looked at him. It felt strangely familiar. Richard slowly walked back to his desk. Where is your father, Mara? He asked gently. The little girl looked at her mother. Emily's expression suddenly became tense. He passed away, she said quietly. Richard nodded respectfully. I'm sorry to hear that. Mara walked back toward her chair. My daddy used to tell funny stories, she said softly. Emily placed her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. Richard watched them silently. Something about this moment felt deeper than a simple conversation, but he couldn't explain why. Just then the assistant returned with juice and snacks. Mara happily took the glass. Thank you. Richard leaned back in his chair. He watched the little girl as she drank the juice happily. And for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in many years. warmth, family. But it didn't make sense. He had never met them before. Or had he? After a few minutes, Emily stood up. "Thank you for your kindness today, sir." Richard nodded politely. "I'm glad the truth was discovered." Emily held Mara's hand. "We should go now." But as they reached the door, Richard suddenly spoke again. "Emily." She turned around. "Yes, sir?" Richard hesitated for a moment. He didn't know why he was asking, but the question slipped out anyway. "Did you ever know someone named Michael Richmond?" Emily froze. Her face instantly turned pale. And in that moment, Richard knew something important had just changed. Because the woman standing in front of him was looking at him, like she had just seen a ghost. Emily stood frozen near the door. Her hand was still holding Mara's small fingers, but her grip had become tight. For a moment, she could not speak. The office felt suddenly quiet. Richard slowly stood from his chair. "Emily," he said gently, "did you hear my question?" She swallowed. "Yes, sir." Her voice sounded weak. Richard walked slowly around the desk. "Did you know someone named Michael Richmond?" The moment the name left his mouth, tears began to form in Emily's eyes. Mara looked up at her mother. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Emily quickly wiped her face. "It's nothing, sweetheart." But Richard could already see the truth written on her face. "Emily," he said quietly, "please answer me." She took a deep breath. "Yes." Richard's heart beat faster. "How did you know him?" Emily hesitated. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet his. "He was my husband." The words felt heavy in the air. Richard stopped moving. For a moment he thought he had heard wrong. "Your husband?" Emily nodded slowly. Richard's mind began racing. Michael Richmond, his younger brother. The brother who had disappeared years ago after a terrible family argument. The brother who had walked away from the family fortune and never returned. The brother Richard had searched for years. Richard's voice became quieter. "Michael married you?" Emily nodded again. "Yes." Richard felt a strange wave of emotions. Shock, confusion, and something deeper. "Where is he now?" Richard asked carefully. Emily's eyes filled with tears again. "He passed away 2 years ago." The room fell silent. Richard lowered his head slightly. For years he had wondered what happened to his brother. Now the truth was standing right in front of him. Then another thought suddenly struck him. His eyes slowly moved toward Mara. The little girl was quietly eating a cookie, unaware of the heavy conversation happening around her. Richard looked back at Emily. His voice became softer. "And Mara?" Emily's lips trembled. "She is his daughter." Richard felt as if the world had suddenly stopped. He looked at the little girl again. The same curious eyes. The same warm smile. The same small dimple on her cheek. Just like Michael used to have. Suddenly Mara looked up and saw Richard staring. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked innocently. Richard slowly walked closer. His heart was pounding. He knelt down in front of her. "Mara," he said gently. "Yes." "Your daddy, his name was Michael?" Mara nodded happily. "Yes. My daddy's name was Michael." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. A deep emotion filled his chest. For years he believed his brother had disappeared forever. But now, a piece of Michael was standing right in front of him. Alive, laughing, smiling. Richard opened his eyes again. Emily was crying quietly now. "I didn't know how to contact your family," she said softly. "Michael never wanted to return after the argument with your father." Richard remembered that argument. Their father had disapproved of Michael's choices. Harsh words were said. Michael left that night, and no one saw him again. Richard looked down at Mara again. The little girl smiled at him innocently. In that moment, Richard realized something incredible. The child who had run into his meeting crying for help was not a stranger. She was his niece, his own brother's daughter. Richard felt a lump in his throat. For years he believed his family had become smaller. But fate had quietly brought someone back into his life. Through the most unexpected moment. Through a little girl brave enough to run into a Billionaire'S meeting and shout, "My mom is in trouble." And suddenly, Richard knew that the story was far from over. The next morning, The sun shone brightly through the tall windows of Richard Richmond's office. But Richard had hardly slept. All night, memories of his younger brother Michael filled his mind. Michael laughing as a child. Michael defending Richard during school fights. Michael leaving home the night their father shouted harsh words at him. For years, Richard believed he had lost his brother forever. Now he knew something different. Michael had left a piece of himself behind. And that piece was Mara. Richard stood by the window looking down at the city when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he said. The door slowly opened. Emily walked in, holding Mara's hand. Mara smiled brightly the moment she saw Richard. "Good morning, Mr. Richard." Richard turned and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mara." The little girl ran toward him happily. Richard knelt down and opened his arms. She hugged him without hesitation. Emily watched the moment quietly. Tears filled her eyes again. For the first time since Michael died, she felt like Mara was no longer alone in the world. Richard gently placed his hands on Mara's shoulders. "Mara," he said softly. "Yes. I told you yesterday that I knew your daddy." Mara nodded excitedly. "Yes. Mommy said you are his big brother." Richard smiled gently. "That means something very special." "What?" Richard looked into her curious eyes. "It means I'm your uncle." Mara blinked. For a moment she looked confused. Then suddenly her face lit up with excitement. "Uncle?" Richard laughed softly. "Yes." Mara jumped happily. "I have an uncle." She hugged him tightly again. Emily covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. For years, life had been difficult. After Michael's death, she struggled to raise Mara alone. Money was tight. Opportunities were few. And sometimes she feared Mara would grow up without family support. But now something unexpected had happened. Family had found them. Richard stood up and looked at Emily. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything my family put Michael through." Emily shook her head. "Michael never hated you," she said softly. "He always said you were the only one who tried to understand him." Richard looked down for a moment. Guilt still lived in his heart. He wished he had searched harder for his brother. But now, perhaps fate had given him another chance. Richard walked to his desk and picked up a small folder. He handed it to Emily. She looked confused. "What is this?" "An offer," Richard replied. Emily opened the folder slowly. Her eyes widened as she read the document. "Finance Department, Senior Accounting Assistant." Her hands began to shake. "Sir, I can't accept this." Richard smiled gently. "You studied accounting." "Yes, but you deserve the chance to use your education." Emily looked overwhelmed. "But why would you do this for me?" Richard glanced down at Mara. "Because my brother trusted you with the most important thing in his life." Mara looked between them curiously. "What are you talking about?" Richard smiled and lifted her into his arms. "You, Mara." She giggled. Later that evening, the company held a small staff gathering in the grand hall. Employees whispered in surprise when Richard walked onto the stage. Beside him stood Emily and Mara. Richard held the microphone calmly. "Yesterday," he said, "a small interruption happened during one of my meetings." The employees laughed softly. A little girl ran into the room shouting that her mother was in trouble. Mara waved proudly. "That was me." The crowd laughed warmly. Richard smiled. But what none of us knew then was that this little girl was not a stranger. He paused. "She is my niece." The entire hall gasped in surprise. Richard placed his hand gently on Mara's shoulder. "And her mother, Emily, is not just an employee. She is family." The room filled with applause. Emily wiped tears from her eyes. Mara held Richard's hand proudly. For the first time in many years, Richard felt something deeper than success. Not wealth, not power, but family. That night, as they stood together near the tall windows of the building, Mara looked up at Richard. "Uncle Richard?" "Yes." "Does this mean we are family forever?" Richard smiled and gently kissed the top of her head. "Yes, Mara. Forever." And in that quiet moment, Richard realized something beautiful. A billionaire's meeting may decide the future of companies. But sometimes, the greatest change in life begins with a little girl brave enough to run through a door and ask for help. And because Richard chose to listen, a broken family found its way back together again. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you find this story worth watching. If you do, kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more beautiful stories, like, comment, and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Your support and engagement encourage me to post more videos. Thanks for watching.